Hi all, and welcome to another installment of your Daily Choose. I'm your host Valdemar. Today I wanted to have a look at a game between Morozevich and Sokolov from the Sarajevo tournament in 2008. It was one of these tournaments where Morozevich was really going very well and at a certain point was maybe virtually even overtaking Kramnik and Anand on the FIDE World ranking. Okay, in the end he won this tournament quite easily, but ended up virtually on the third spot of the world rankings. Okay, in this game he's playing white against Ivan Sokolov, who has not been playing so much lately, but let's have a look at the game. E4 was played, and Sokolov usually plays E5, he plays these openings, and Morozevich now opts for the Scottish game with D4. Bishop b4 check is played now to provoke c2, c3. So now it's not possible for this knight from b1 to go to its natural development square. Bishop c5. And now several moves are possible, but Morozevich chooses to double black's pawns on the queen side. Knight takes c6, b takes c6, and later on in the game we will see that this will have some significance. Bishop d3, knight e7. These are all well-known theoretical moves. Castles, castles. And now Morozevich plays bishop g5. More regular would be to play knight d2. But this move is also possible, of course, and it seems that not much is going on in the position. I suppose the positions are roughly equal at this stage. f6 to break the pin on the knight. Bishop h4. d6, and now the aforementioned knight d2, knight g6 attacking the bishop on h4, bishop g3, and now this is an important moment. Very solid looks the move knight e5, which attacks the bishop on on d3, maybe prepares to also go to c4 at some stage, maybe in conjunction with a move like bishop e6. And also the knight is of course very stable on this square here on e5. You could say that it is some sort of an outpost, because as soon as white chooses to chase away this knight, then the bishop on g3 will be worse, and also the knight might possibly come into g4, hitting some weak black squares in conjunction with the bishop on c5. Well, that's an awful lot of arrows, but I suppose you get the message. Okay, anyway, after bishop g3, this is not what Ivan Sokolov played. He did play f5, and I'm not so sure about this move. Maybe objectively not so much is going on, but somehow he's opening up his position on the white squares. And well, Morozevich exchanges on f5, and now again exchanges on f5, and of course black now has developed his, you could say, final light piece. The bishop from c8 is now in the game and out of the game, and he has exchanged it for this nice bishop that was on d3. But on the other hand, the more pieces that get exchanged, the more closer the endgame is, and also the more important the factor becomes that white has, let me click these one away, has 2 pawn islands, whereas black has 3 pawn islands. And the closer the endgame, the more important it will be that there are weak pawns here and here, for instance, on black's queen side. Also, since the bishop from c8 has been exchanged, there are less defenders on the white squares, and you can imagine that with a move like queen b3 hitting this weak and vulnerable diagonal, or this weak spot on b7, that white has some opportunities to gain the advantage. And last but not least, also the rook on f5 is quite vulnerable. So, now how did Morozevich continue? He played here a2, a4. and the threat is quite obvious. He just wants to trap the bishop with b4, and then if it moves to b6, then a4, a5 will win the bishop and the game immediately. So at this stage, Sokolov chose to play a6, but this puts another pawn on a white square, and there's another weakness here also. I suppose that instead of a6, it would have been a little bit better to play a7, a5, where this pawn is somehow restricting white's possibilities on the queen side, and yeah, blocking this pawn also. And last but not least, it's not on a white square where it is after the text move that was played a6. Okay, now Morozevich takes charge. He goes to the white squares. Queen b3 check, and king h8 is played, and now queen b7. And with this move, he hits both these weak pawns on a6 and c6. And, well, apparently, and why not? Apparently, Sokolov saw nothing better than rook b8, which makes sense, because now Morozevich wins this weak pawn on a6, which would not have been possible if the pawn were an a5, mind you, but now black recaptures and regains a pawn on b2. And this is not too bad, of course, if you consider that the rook is now very actively placed on the second rank, and in conjunction with the bishop on c5 and the other rook on f5, has already an eye on the f2 square 3 times. Okay, there is one other thing to consider here, of course, and that is the fact that now, because of this pawn exchange, white has a very serious and strong free pawn that can quite easily move up the board and try to queen. Okay, but for the moment, the knight on d2 is attacked by the rook on b2, and Morozevich moves it to e4. Now, that's a very logical square, of course. The threat is not really to take on c5, because then the black rook will be happy to recapture and put pressure on this weak c file and the weak c3 pawn. No, it's just more to yeah, just to move the knight out of harm's way and look at some squares in black's camp, of course. Now, since this point here on f2 is very well protected 4 times at the moment, and there is also this strong free a pawn, it would seem that white has an advantage. He just has to move his queen. Maybe he can even recapture this pawn here on c6 and then just move his a pawn. This is a very logical, simple positional plan. Also, his king side is very safe at the moment. He's got 3 pawns to defend his own king, whereas black only has got 2 pawns to defend his king. So you could say that positionally and structurally white has an advantage, and that black has to play very actively to try and maintain the balance. And he tries to do that with the next move, but as you can imagine, this is a very double-edged move, I think is the right English word to use. This is a very double-edged move. He plays h7, h5. And now, why is it double-edged? Well, it's quite obvious that he is very seriously weakening all these white squares around his own king side, and that he really needs his pieces to keep all these squares together, all these weaknesses on the white squares. But on the other hand, it's also very logical in the sense that he now creates a counterplay, and he is threatening to play a move like h4, after which the bishop on g2 would be in trouble, of course. And even if the bishop could save itself, but had to move away from the square g3, then of course the pressure on f2 will become more serious. So a double-edged move, but also a move that makes sense as long as black can defend his weaknesses on the white squares. Okay, now Morozevich defends against the aforementioned threat with h2, h4, blocking this pawn, and now all of a sudden this pawn has become a target, of course. But also the bishop on g3 is a little bit less protected. But as we can see, White still has got the better of it. And probably at this moment, Sokolov makes a mistake, a very serious mistake. Since there are so many weaknesses here on these white squares, White would really like to return his queen, or to retreat, I'd like to say. And he could retreat, for instance, to a square like e2, where he would be immediately hitting this h5 pawn. Or he could return the queen to c4, from where it could go to a square like e6, and where it is double attacking these both unprotected black pieces. So, from that point of view, I suppose best, or at least most tenacious for black would have been to play knight f4 in this position, with the threat of knight e2 check, exchanging this important defender of the f2 pawn. And after this move, White would probably have to protect against that threat with a move like rook fe1, and then after a move like king h7, when black is preparing maybe g6 to try and hold on to these white squares, black would have been off better than in the game. Now what did he play after h2 a4? He played the passive rook b6. And it makes sense in the way that now, of course, it's not possible for White to go through the rook and take the pawn on c6. But this rook was very actively placed on b2, and it was also attacking the f2 square. And last but not least, it now gives White the opportunity, or chases White into the opportunity to retreat the queen and hit these weak white squares. As mentioned, queen e2 was a strong move here, but also the move that Morozevich chooses, which is queen c4, looks very strong, because now the threat is to play queen e6, and then in order not to lose one of his pieces, black would have to give up the exchange with rook f6, and then of course there would follow knight takes f6, which would be losing for black. So Ivan Sokolov now decides to defend this diagonal with his queen on g8, but now Morozevich switches and he plays queen e2, hitting this weak pawn on h5, but at the moment it is still protected, of course. Now apparently black didn't see any better move than to play rook b8, already going out of the way of this strong free pawn, and he played rook b8. And now White really seizes the initiative with his next move. He plays knight g5, and of course this blocks the defense of the rook to the pawn on h5, and White is now really threatening to take the pawn. And there is also no possibility for black to prevent, so he has to choose a way in which he can give up the pawn let's say in a way that he has the least damage. Of course it is possible here to sacrifice the exchange with something like rook g5, hg5, and then h4, and after bishop h2 I think that White has a winning advantage here, even though it's not so clear what this bishop is going to do in the remainder of the game, because it is quite hemmed in for now. But, well, there is, strictly speaking, a material advantage for White. He has this strong free pawn. But maybe black could fight because of the fact that this bishop, you know, it doesn't really have access to all these squares. It's very difficult to see how it would come into the game. Maybe White would have to try something like this, but this is very academic maybe, you know. And then the bishop could be activated over the g1 square. Okay, but after knight g5, black chose to play knight f8, which is very important, because White was not only just threatening to win the pawn, but he was threatening to simply mate by taking on h5, and now there is an extra defender of the h7 square. Of course Morozevich now takes this pawn, and he must be winning at this stage. Now there are two legal possibilities to defend against the check, and the best one, funnily enough, would have been to give up the queen, because if white now takes the queen, then black can simply take white's queen, and after an exchange on f8 we have an endgame where white is a pawn up and it's a free pawn, but maybe, just maybe, black would have had some chances in blocking this this free pawn, maybe, you know, something like that, or maybe just putting some extra pressure on the f2 pawn. Also, this pawn could become a little bit weak, maybe, or this one. I suppose that white still has very good winning chances and maybe is winning objectively, but this would have been a way to prolong the struggle. After queen takes h5, however, black played knight h7, which really puts this piece into a pin, and now this whole block on the king side is stuck somehow. Okay, now white brings in his rook a1, and the threat now is just to enter on the 7th or the 8th rank. At least it's quite obvious that this is a very soft spot, so if black would ever decide to move the rook here over the b file, then of course rook e8 would follow and black would immediately lose his queen. So this means that this rook has to remain on the 8th rank to protect against these threats. Now bishop b6 was played, already having a look at this pawn here. Now rook e7 followed, very nicely putting some pressure here over the 7th rank, and of course we all have read Morozevich My System, and we know that a rook is very strong here on the 7th rank. Yeah, more specifically, this rook is also looking at the f7 square, where by now 3 white pieces are coming together. So at this moment white is actually threatening to play a move like knight f7 check, which would win the exchange. So this explains black's next move. He plays rook b f8, protecting against that threat. And now Morozevich played a very nasty move. He played king h2, and this is some sort of a waiting move. But in moving away his king from the defense of this f2 square, he is saying to Sokolov, who, I don't know, but was probably in time pressure or under pressure any case in this game, listen, I'm letting go of the protection of f2. If you want to take this pawn with either bishop or rook, well, please do so. But I suppose that Sokolov felt what was happening here, and he didn't take on f2. Let's see what could have happened if he took, for instance, with his bishop. Then there would follow rook f2, bishop f2, rook f2, and now the very nasty rook e8. And the only defense would be rook f8, not to lose the queen, but then of course there would be an exchange on f8, and there would no longer be a protector of the h7 mating square. So in this position, sorry, what am I saying? Knight h7, queen h7 of course would be mate in this position. So that's the trick that Morozevich had up his sleeve. Well, you might ask, okay, let's not take with the bishop then on f2, but let's take with the rook. But then white would simply take the exchange, and then if rook f2, again of course rook e8 with similar problems. Okay, so after king h2, Sokolov chose to play rook 5, f6, which is probably the only good move on the board. But now Morozevich is able to move his free pawn because of a tactical possibility. He plays a4, a5, and yeah, it looks weird, because isn't it possible for the black bishop to take this pawn a5? Yes, of course, it is possible, but don't forget that the queen is not only looking in the direction of the black king, but it's also looking all the way over to black's queen side and is indirectly protecting this pawn on a5. Okay, now we will see shortly after this how the game ended, but another option would have been after a5 to play rook h6. But then there is a funny in-between queen sacrifice possible. Queen takes rook, pawn takes queen, and now, because of this check, rook h7, black has to return the favor, give up his own queen, and you can imagine that after this position, white is very simply winning. So after a5 in the game, Sokolov chose to play bishop takes a5, but then of course there was a clearing of the fifth rank, knight takes h7, queen takes h7, and after queen takes a5, Sokolov resigned. Well, Morozevich went on to win this tournament with, I think, 7.5 points out of 10 and something close to a 2900 ELO performance, tournament performance rating. And well, I just wanted to pay some attention to Morozevich and his latest success. So, I hope you've enjoyed this game, and please, until next time, bye bye.